Would you like to paint on other things besides a store-bought canvas, like cardboard, wood or rocks, but you don't know if you should somehow prep them first? Well, I've tried painting on all of them, and here's what happened. Do you really have to prime cardboard with gesso before painting? Hi everyone! So a year or two ago I made a video about how I prepare cardboard for painting by priming it with gesso and why you might want to do that. But today I'm testing if you really have to prime it by showing you a comparison of painting on primed and unprimed cardboard with acrylics and seeing if the results look different or not, and whether I'll be contradicting what I said in that video. I'm cutting up the piece of cardboard so you can get a fair comparison. This was quite thick. It's the backing of a watercolor pad. So I had to use a utility knife to cut it in half and then a nail file to smooth out the cut because I couldn't get a clean cut. And finally I used little nail scissors to clean off the rest. I've used up a few of these same watercolor pads before, and I like painting on their cardboard backs because they're sturdy and they don't bend that much. But I wouldn't normally cut them up like this. I did this just so you can get a comparison with the exact same type and color of cardboard. I primed one piece with Liquitex Basics white acrylic gesso, 2 coats, one vertical, one horizontal, and let it dry for a couple of hours. I had 2 rough sketches of owls in my sketchbook and I freehand sketched them on the cardboard with a watercolor pencil in a bigger size. The references I had were tawny owls, but I completely changed the color scheme. I wanted to use the same colors in both paintings though, so you can actually compare them. The acrylic paints I was using were mostly plus color paints, which are opaque, but also a few other more transparent paints as well. The first difference between them is that when I'm painting on the unprimed cardboard, it gets wet. You can see the paint is soaking into it. But I have to say the cardboard on its own is a smoother surface than gesso. The brush strokes don't show up as much on the unprimed surface. You can, however, sand down gesso to make it smoother in between the layers and after the final layer. I don't usually bother doing that, but it could have made a difference here. Also, in the beginning stages, the primed painting looked shinier, whereas the unprimed painting definitely looked more matte in the first layer. The experiences I've had before with painting on unprimed cardboard were using transparent acrylics and also Mola paints from IKEA, which I thought were acrylics until I realized they reactivate with water. So I guess they were actually poster paints, but that's besides the point. In both of those cases I had trouble getting the paint to look opaque. But this time the paintings are starting to look very similar with a few layers. So it also depends on the type of paints you're using. I think I had a better experience this time because I was using only opaque acrylics, or at least mixing the transparent acrylics with the opaque ones, and also layering them. The paints and other supplies I used will be listed below in the description. Did I have to layer the unprimed painting more than the primed one to make it look the same? I can't really tell. Judging by the footage I have, the owl on the unprimed cardboard took a bit longer to paint. But that might be because I just wasn't happy with how it was looking and had to paint over some parts. And not so much because the paint would not cover enough, and I'd have to keep layering to get the same coverage as with the primed one. So when I was finished, it seemed like there was no difference between the paintings. You wouldn't be able to tell which one was primed and which one wasn't. But I can't tell you how they would look over time, maybe in a few years. So, yes, you can paint on cardboard without priming it first. Yes, you can have the painting look exactly the same, but it depends on what you're planning to do with the painting. Gesso creates a layer between the cardboard and the acrylic paints or oil paints so that they don't soak into the cardboard. Gesso is also going to protect the painting from a possible acidic surface. If the painting surface is not acid-free, the painting will not last as long and it can yellow over time. So it's your choice. It depends on whether you want the painting to last longer or if it's okay that it doesn't. If you're painting on cardboard, you already know it's going to degrade over time and it won't last forever, whether you prime it or not. I'm interested to see how these two will age over the years though, compared to each other. Would you like to use cardboard for your oil paintings, and have you wondered if you need to prime the cardboard with gesso first? Let's see. Hi everyone! I made a video about a year ago comparing painting on primed and unprimed cardboard with acrylics. Someone asked in the comments if anyone has tried painting on unprimed cardboard with oils. Well, I hadn't, but when I saw the comment I thought I need to try it. I used 2 pieces of the same type of cardboard, something that was thick enough to not be bendy and that was already cut in 2, since I realized I don't have a carpet knife right now to cut it. I primed 1 piece of cardboard by painting white acrylic gesso on it. You can use acrylic gesso under both acrylic and oil paintings. And you can also tone it by mixing in another acrylic paint if you don't want a bright white background. The gesso I use is Liquid X Basics. I've had this bottle for about 4 years and have used it a lot, and it's still not running out. I use this for max A4 size paintings or a lot smaller, like in this case though, so I don't need a lot of gesso for one painting. These are about 10.5 by 11.5 centimeters. All the supplies and paints I used are listed below if you're interested in any of them. I painted 2 coats of gesso on the cardboard and then let it dry for a while after each coat. The instructions say to let it dry for 24 hours, which I rarely do. More like 30 minutes to a few hours. I'll use one of the paintings for my niece's birthday card, and I wanted to paint canaries, so I sketched out 2 different poses in my sketchbook first and then onto each cardboard piece with a colored pencil. I searched for bird oil paintings online and pinned some that I liked the style of into a hidden Pinterest board. It doesn't have to be hidden, but I like to use hidden boards when I'm planning for a new painting. I'll show you some of the images and try to find the sources for each of them. I also had some of my own photos of canary birds, but those were not taken in good lighting and they were taken kind of far away because I didn't want to bother or scare the birds too much, and I used those to sketch the poses. I also searched for canary bird photos on Pixabay and Pexels, and finally just did a Google search. But I used those photos for getting the details right, like the eyes and the beak, since my own photos were just not clear enough for that. But I'm saying I used those in a way that it wouldn't be obvious that I used someone else's photo as a reference. It's just important to get some of those key details right, even if it isn't meant to be a realistic painting. The oil paints I used are Marie's water mixable oil color studio paints, and I used an old glass frame as a palette. As a disclaimer, I don't do much oil painting usually. I prefer acrylics and watercolors since they are faster for me. I hadn't touched my oil paints in a long time before this, and some of the paint tubes had leaked. It looks like the oil separated and came out. And when I opened the lid of the glass jar where I keep linseed oil, it smelled so bad and it had actually dried. The difference I can see right away in the paintings is that when the cardboard is not primed, it looks wet when painted on and it's soaking up the oil from the paint. The primed painting looks shiny and the unprimed one looks matte, so there's a different effect. The colors also appear brighter on the primed cardboard. but then again that one has a white background and the other one has a cardboard brown background, so that accounts for some of the difference. I have been asked how about replacing the white gesso with white paint. Well, I don't have enough white oil paint to try that right now, but I can try it with white acrylic paint, so I'm keeping that video idea in mind. The unprimed painting might also look more muted because I was using the same brushes without cleaning them much in between, and they were getting dirtier and picking up more paint, and the shades were getting mixed and the colors turned out a bit more muted because of that. But I don't think that accounts for much of the differences between the paintings. After the first painting session, I left the paintings to dry, covered the glass frame palette with plastic wrap and cleaned the brushes with water and soap. The paints will stay wet on the palette for a while, so continuing the next day or even the day after that with the leftover paints is fine. And that's what I did. I finished the paintings the next day. I used the plastic wrap to slow down the drying and keep the dust away. As I said, I washed the brushes with soap and water, but they do still stain though. So if anyone has a suggestion on a non-toxic yet cheap way of cleaning them from water mixable oil paint, please tell me in the comments. I chose water mixable oil paints specifically so that I wouldn't need any solvents. I also have a set of traditional oil paints that I've never tried because I don't have a solvent to use with them, and I'm not interested in getting a toxic solvent or one that smells toxic anyway. So I'd like to know what the alternatives are that would be easily available. One of the brushes actually broke while I was painting. The head came off the handle. It was one of the brushes with a blue handle, and I think they're Crelando brushes from Lidl, just in case you're thinking of getting a set of those. I don't remember having this problem with them before though. The next day, both of the paintings are still wet and the primed painting still appears shiny. The problem with painting right to the edges is that I would constantly get blue paint on my hands when I had to keep the painting in place or switch between paintings, even though I tried to be careful. So using an easel would be best, but these paintings are too small for my easel. It's funny that I usually try to blend softly with acrylics, even though they don't naturally work like that, since they dry fast. They're more suitable for blocky colors. Whereas oils have a long drying time, so they're easy to blend, and yet I chose oils and a more abstracted style where I didn't want to blend much and ended up accidentally blending and mudding up the colors, because I didn't want to wait for the previous layers to dry. You can see the difference in the finished paintings clearer than in the earlier video where I compared acrylic paintings on primed and unprimed cardboard. In that video you could initially see how the acrylic paint soaked into the unprimed cardboard, but after more layers the outcomes look about the same. In this case though, there's a clear difference, at least while the oil paint is still wet. So if you prime the cardboard first, the outcome will be shiny, more like a painting on a primed canvas, but if you paint directly onto cardboard without priming, you get a matte, darker finish as the oil soaks into the cardboard. This is what I was expecting based on what I found online beforehand, but what was surprising to me is that the primed painting started bending, but the unprimed one didn't. So you might want to prime both sides to prevent the cardboard bending, or use a thinner coat of gesso than I did. I didn't dilute the gesso with water at all. Based on the amount of footage I have, it seems I used more time on the unprimed painting, and I felt like I had to add more layers, especially on the bird, because the coverage was bad. The paint just wasn't opaque on this surface. I let the paintings dry for a few days and show you what they look like after that, in case they'll change after drying more. Since the paints I used are water mixable oil paints, they dry faster than traditional oil paints. It depends on how much oil you add while painting though. I did not use much linseed oil. I did mix in some in the beginning, but realized it's resulting in a different look than I wanted, since it makes the paints translucent and I wanted thicker paints, and stopped using it, except to reactivate some of the dried paint on the palette. I also avoided using water to dilute the paint. I've made a video about water mixable oils before if you want to know more about how to use them. Just as with the acrylic cardboard painting video, I'll mention that you can do this whichever way you want, prime it first or don't prime it. The result is clearly different, so it depends on the outcome you want. But if you don't prime it, the painting will not last as long, since you don't have the primer protecting it. If you don't mind that it doesn't last and that you might end up using more paint than you would on a primed surface, and you like the matte effect of the painting on unprimed cardboard, then you don't need to prime it. Can you paint over a used canvas without priming it? Let's see. I got another free painting from the reuse center that we're going to paint over, half by priming it with gesso and the other half by painting straight over it using acrylics, so we can see the difference once the new painting is finished. It looks like a store-bought pre-primed canvas. I'm guessing the old painting is acrylic and some kind of marker. Let's test if the marker reactivates with water. It doesn't, so we can paint over it. There are multiple parts where the paint is thicker, and we're gonna want to even those out one way or another. This old sandpaper piece is falling apart, but we can just wipe off the dust afterwards. I missed some parts, so I'm going back in with an old knife this time, so you can see that works too. Now let's mark the middle, and I'm just gonna write on the back which side is which. Actually, I want them the other way. I'm going to weigh the same amount of gesso and white acrylic paint to make this somewhat comparable. But since I know it will be hard to cover the old painting completely, let's tint the white gesso a bluish grey and mix a similar color for the other side. The gesso is covering up the old painting pretty well in just one layer. I'm gonna let it dry and save the leftovers in the fridge for any touch-ups. I'm using an opaque white acrylic paint for the paint side, and I did not do this on purpose, but this side turned out a lighter grey. You can see there isn't as much coverage on the paint side. The black marker outlines are still visible. Some of it might be because of the lighter shade, but also the white paint just doesn't have the same coverage as gesso. The second layer was just for touching up the areas that were still showing through. The next difference I can see is that the gesso side is matte and the paint side is shiny. I sketched on the canvas with a watercolor pencil and it doesn't really show up on the paint side. My initial idea was to use one of the dominant colors in the old painting as the base color to make it easier to cover up, and then use that as a contrasting background color for the new acrylic painting. So, since the old painting was mostly blue and green, I planned to make a mainly red and yellow landscape, sunset landscape. But I didn't exactly end up sticking to that plan, as you'll see from how the color scheme progressed. But I don't mind painting on a more neutral background color like grey. When I've done priming versus not priming videos before, I've usually given the finished paintings away as presents. But this time I'm going to keep the painting so I can update you if there's any longer term difference between the two sides. So while I'm finishing up the painting, can you cover up the old painting with paint instead of gesso? If you're okay with this ghost showing through, you can. No, really. I think I say the same thing in every video, but it depends on the old painting. This one was painted with probably acrylics on a pre-primed canvas, and it didn't seem to be varnished, so I don't see any problem with painting straight over this old painting with acrylics. It might just require more paint layers to cover up the old painting, as you saw, than if you were to use gesso and you want a clean slate with nothing showing through. But if it was varnished or the old painting was done in oils, it gets trickier. A varnished painting I would prime first, and oil painting is more complicated than that. Have you tried painting on shiny cardboard and have it turn out like this? The painting looks very streaky, all brush strokes are visible, the coverage is not good. I tried 3 ways to find the best method for painting on glossy cardboard like this. I tried sanding one of the pieces to give the paint more of a rough surface to attach to. I tried priming one of them with gesso, which is something you can do to paint even on plastic, where the paint would otherwise just roll off from. And I tried a combination of sanding and priming with gesso. I wrote the methods on the back side of the cardboard so we can compare the results at the end. I decided to paint houseplants. I skipped the pencil sketch this time and I'm sketching with a paintbrush. I'm using the Crelando acrylic paints from Lidl and a few more opaque plus color paints. I can tell right away that the paint is spreading differently than in my first try. The coverage is better in just one layer and it's looking less streaky. All 3 paintings are warping a bit, at least while wet. I'm painting a Monstera deliciosa, a devil's ivy or golden pothos, and a plant that I don't actually have, so I took the reference photo at a flower shop because I think the peacock plant is so photogenic. I'm thinking of turning these into bookmarks and trying different ways of sealing the paint, but let's leave that for later. The finished paintings have different textures to them. The unprimed one still feels smooth, but the other 3 feel a little rough. So both sanding and gesso alone give the cardboard some tooth. The peacock plant one was only sanded. The Monstera leaf was gessoed and the devil's ivy was both sanded and primed. I did paint more layers on the primed and sanded ones, but even with the first layer, they look different from the completely unprimed one. If you like the look of the brushstrokes showing, glossy cardboard definitely enhances that. But if you don't like that effect, then manipulating the cardboard in one of these ways might be a good idea. I can't tell a clear difference between the sanded and gessoed ones. I guess it's enough to just break up or roughen up the surface in some way. The one with just gesso, no sanding, is still warped after drying, unlike the others. I'm not sure why it's just that one. I also think if you just continue painting more layers on the unprimed one, you could probably hide the brush strokes and eventually get better coverage. I did only spend 10 minutes on it, whereas the others took 20 or 30 minutes each. Do you need to prime wood for acrylic painting, and how do you get the wood texture to show through the gesso if you do prime it? Let's see. I'm wiping off the dust from the wood pieces before I start. I don't know how much paint they're going to soak up unprimed. Is the paint going to flake off or fade over time? So I'll try priming only one of them to see the difference. I've had my white gesso for years, but I want the wood pattern and color to show up as the background, and obviously the white gesso would cover that, so I'm using a clear, transparent gesso instead. It has the same ingredients as the white gesso, except it's missing the white paint. I'm not exactly sure what these wood pieces are and where they came from, but they seem like plywood and that they were maybe supposed to be the front and back cover of a book based on the shape. But either way, no one's missing them and they are a free material to paint on. I'm applying 2 coats of gesso on one of the wood pieces and letting it dry for a few hours in between. The recommended drying time is 24 hours. I painted 1 coat horizontally and the second coat vertically. After priming, there is a slight color difference. The primed one is a little bit darker and there is a difference in texture. The primed one feels a bit rough and the unprimed one is smoother. After the gesso, I transferred the sketches to the wood pieces. I'm continuing my bird painting series and I sketched out the budgies on grid paper first and transferred that onto the wood pieces with graphite transfer paper by placing it in between the wood and the grid paper and taping the sketch down to keep it in place. And then I'm just redrawing the lines with a ballpoint pen, a pencil or a marker, depending on what shows through the best. On the wood it turned out to be just a pencil. The graphite sketch can sometimes smudge your painting, so I decided to isolate it by painting matte medium over the graphite lines, so the graphite will stay sealed underneath and not touch the actual paints. And now I'm ready to paint. I'm painting on the unprimed wood piece first. I'm using the same acrylic paints, the opaque plus color paints and the less opaque Crelando acrylic paints on both wood pieces. I'll paint the budgies different colors, but I'm using a mix of opaque and more translucent paints on both of them. I was using stock photos from Pixabay and Pexels, and I wanted to make this budgie with a flower crown a female, and how you can tell is the color of the cere, which is the nose and the nostril area. For males, it's first light blue or purple and then turns darker blue. And for females, it's brown, beige, pink, white or light blue. Basically anything but dark blue. The color of the feathers doesn't determine whether they're male or female, so I decided to make this one white and blue and the other one green and yellow. The possible things that could happen with painting on unprimed wood would be the wood soaking up the paint, so you'd have to keep painting more and more layers, or the paint eventually peeling or flaking off or fading. The opaque paints are looking nice and bright on the unprimed wood, and the more translucent ones I had to mix with an opaque paint to make them show up better. I did notice there was some friction. I often use these soft watercolor brushes for acrylic painting, but I had to switch to these more rigid paint brushes later on. Probably because it's a harder and less textured surface than I would usually paint on, like paper or canvas. If I use a more watery acrylic paint on it, by just adding more water to the paint, the wood gets visibly wet and the paint does feather out on the wood a little bit. So before I show you how the unprimed one turned out and what I painted for the background, let's paint the primed one. Another thing I noticed from the reference photos was that some budgies have big black eyes and others seem to have a light-colored iris outside the black pupil. And that's because they generally have black irises when they're young, and then they change color to brown, white or reddish when they grow up. I didn't realize the sketches were such a different size, so the one holding the flower turned out smaller than the one with the flower crown. But the flower holding one still has bigger eyes in proportion. I remembered Leah Gardner Art on Instagram paints a lot of birds, and even though I didn't find a budgie painting from her, I did look at her pigeon paintings for some extra stylistic reference, although my paintings didn't turn out at all as smooth looking as hers. Painting on the primed wood, I feel like the paint goes on a bit smoother. Opaqueness maybe depends more on the type of paint I'm using rather than whether the surface was primed or not in this case. But I will say I like the hard and smooth surface to paint on, especially once I realized I need to use the harder paint process. And I think I'm gonna need to paint on wood again, maybe trying a different type of wood or different paints, because I also don't know how these wood pieces were treated before I found them. Did they maybe have some kind of a coating after all, even though they didn't look or feel like it? The one on the left is unprimed and the one on the right is primed, and once they're finished, I don't think you'd be able to tell which one was which if you didn't know. Both have bright colors and the primed one is maybe ever so slightly shinier, but I will keep these and hang them on the wall next to each other so I can see if there are any differences over time I should update you about. You can make clay flower pots look so unique by painting on them, but do you have to prime them first? I'll test it both ways, put it in the garden for the summer, and then check back to see if one way survived the weather better than the other. So I washed the flower pot with water and soap and a nail brush first. I let it dry and a couple of days later I marked on the bottom of the pot with a black paint marker which side will be primed and which one will not be primed, since I only found one small pot to use for this. I'm using clear gesso for priming one half of the pot, so the color of the white gesso doesn't obscure our results. I let it dry for a couple of hours. The only difference I can see at this point is that the gessoed side is shinier than the other one. Now I figured I should maybe test varnishing the painting too, so I added new markings for that. So we'll have a comparison between unprimed, unvarnished or varnished and primed, unvarnished or varnished at the end. I decided to try one stroke painting again and I'll paint different flowers on each side. Neither of the videos I used as tutorials specify what the flower is, but on the primed side I painted this pink flower that looks like an aster, I suppose. Each petal is painted in one stroke and I'm adding leaves and some details to the middle of the flower at the end. For the unprimed side, I painted this blue flower. My reasoning for choosing these flowers was that you can paint it using just a round brush, because that seemed to be the easiest for me when I tried one-stroke painting the first time. I let the acrylic paintings dry and then varnished half of the pot with the Winsor & Newton acrylic gloss varnish so that only half of each flower is varnished. Since this is gloss varnish, it means that the varnished side of each flower is shinier than the other side. I let the paintings dry for a couple of days and then planted a geranium into terracotta pot and took it outside in the garden for the summer in a place where it gets sunlight and rain on both sides. I leave it like this for a couple of months and we'll see what happens.
Many months later.
It's been almost 3 months and as you can see the flower pot has been in the rain and it's all dirty, but if we clean it I'm not seeing much difference to when I painted it. You can see the gesso leaves this white sheen on the pot and so does the varnish. The not primed painting is more translucent, the color of the pot shows through, but it might be because I layered the other painting more. No peeling or paint cracking on either side, yet anyway, but I'm thinking this isn't a long enough test and it might be a different story by next summer. So I'll update you if I see any difference later on. 3 months earlier. You can use painted stones as decor inside and outside, but do you have to prime them first? I'll test it both ways, put them in the garden for the summer and then check back to see how they survive the rain and the sun. I gathered some smooth rocks outside. The smoother they are, the easier to paint on. I washed the stones with rainwater first and then let them dry, and before painting anything, I marked on the bottom of the stones with a black paint marker which ones are primed and which ones are not. I decided to try varnishing them too, so I can compare between unprimed, unvarnished and varnished, and primed, unvarnished and varnished at the end. I'm using clear gesso for priming 2 of the stones, so the color of the white gesso doesn't affect our results, but you could use white or colored gesso just as well. I let them dry for a couple of hours, and the gesso made the stones a bit shinier, but that's the only difference at this point. I decided to paint these fantasy-looking cutesy bugs this time that I can put in the garden, making them all look a bit different, combining ideas I found on Pinterest. I started by sketching on the stones with a white-colored pencil, because I thought that would show up well on these darker grey stones. And then I'm using acrylics to paint on them. I'm using some Crelando acrylic paints from Lidl and some more opaque plus color paints as well. I'm gonna run out of the pink soon and I'm so sad. I need to get some more of these less common colors once the pink one is finished. These would certainly look better if the stones were a bit more symmetric, but what can you do? The insects are just gonna be a bit wonky this time. Instead of using bristles to paint the dots, I turned the brush around and dipped the other end in the paint and used that as a dotting tool. It didn't work that well on the uneven surface though. Let's not forget the details like the antenna and the eyelashes that insects definitely have in real life. I let the acrylic paintings dry for a day and then varnished 2 of the stones with the Winsor & Newton acrylic gloss varnish. They'll be easy to spot since the unvarnished rocks look matte next to the 2 shiny ones. I let the varnish dry for a few days and then took the stones outside in the garden for the summer in a place where they get sunlight and rained on. And I leave them like this for a couple of months and then we'll see what happened.
Many months later.
It's been nearly 3 months and the rocks have been outside in the rain and sun for the summer, and I think it's safe to say that the paint pen markings underneath didn't survive that well in some of them. The paint on top of the rocks is still doing very well though. I didn't notice anything at first, but looking more closely and comparing to the before photos, I saw that the one that's primed but not varnished shows the most paint cracking and chipping at this point in the light yellow part. And the one that's not primed but is varnished also has some yellow paint missing. Might be something to do with the quality of the yellow paint or with how much water I was using, since it's only the yellow paint. If you dilute acrylics with too much water, they might crack eventually. But I leave these outside for the winter and update you if there's a clearer difference after that. You want to paint on pressed leaves, but don't know if you should prime them first. I'll test it both ways and let's see how it turns out. I'm using leaves I collected last summer and pressed inside a magazine and some paper towel under heavy books. I ended up going with 2 oak leaves and 2 hibiscus leaves. I'm following Katie Brooks's method for prepping the pressed leaves. I'm taping them down with masking tape. Make sure to make the tape less sticky first, and then I'm painting the backside with matte medium and letting it dry for a day. I chose the lighter oak leaf and the bigger hibiscus leaf to prime. I did this on 2 leaves because I thought I'd try clear gesso on one of them and white on the other. So once they were dry, I peeled them off and turned them around, again taping them down and then priming the oak leaf with the clear gesso so I could use the color of the leaf in the painting, and I used the white gesso for the already yellowed leaf. And then I gave them plenty of time to dry before peeling off the tape and putting them under some weights again to keep them flat. The last time I did this, I was kind of in a hurry and didn't give them enough time to dry, and you can see what happens if you do that in that video after you've watched this one. I started painting on the yellowed hibiscus leaves first using acrylic paints. The reference photos I'm using are from a little road trip we did this summer to see a 700-year-old castle and a 19th century open-air museum in Turku. These are just photos I took on the way back of one of the tunnels and of a field landscape. The tunnels especially I thought looked interesting enough to include in a painting. So on the leaf that's not primed, the paint looked very watery in the beginning, not covering much, and on the primed leaf, which is the bigger leaf, there was better coverage, the paint didn't feel watery, but the gesso started peeling off in some areas. It's been a week since the priming, so it's not because it would still be wet. I only did 1 layer though, so maybe I should have done 2. The unprimed leaf is flimsier and the primed one is a little more sturdy, so I imagine it will survive better over time. The coverage issue with the unprimed leaf was solved by just adding more layers of paint. The shininess is a lighting thing, so I'll switch them around the other way so you can see that it changes which one looks shinier. I don't see much of a difference between these two otherwise. I've been wanting to do some kind of a birdhouse painting, so I did a simple birdhouse and some small birds in different colors on the oak leaves. Not very realistic, just some simplified birds in different poses, some perching, some flying, and a few white branches thrown in there at the end. The primed leaf is the one on the right that looks a little lighter or more of a yellowish green. The primed one had slightly better coverage, but I'm not noticing much else different. The gesso also makes it shinier, the other one is more matte. Oak leaves are sturdier anyway, so not much of a difference, except the primed leaf actually happened to be thinner in the first place and it's more see-through from the back. With these ones there is a bit of a difference at the end. Some of the colors like the red bird and the blue bird look brighter or more vibrant on the primed leaf. So the extra base layer seemed to help with that. As usual, I'll keep this and make an update later if I notice a difference in yellowing or fading or paint peeling over time. What happens when you paint on raw wood with oils? Let's compare painting on primed and unprimed wood using oil paints. I found these wood pieces from a logging area in the woods years ago. I think I sanded them last summer since it looks like I've removed the bark from around them, but I lost the video footage when my external hard drive broke. I primed one of them with clear gesso and left the other one raw. I did 2 layers with a sponge brush, giving it a few hours in between to dry and then letting it dry overnight. I wrote on the back which one is which in case I'll forget. I had not touched these oil paints in years and it seems like there's been some separation and leaking, so I'm using a glove to handle the paint tubes. The titanium white wouldn't even open without pliers. I've apparently never opened the green ones before, so I started without them. I'm using a glass frame as a palette. I started with the primed wood piece and I tried the quick Prima painting method. No pencil sketch, I'm just going in with paint, doing a simple sketch with a paintbrush and one of the blue paints to make a loose, simplified painting and paint it faster. I'm using some of my old photos as references for these paintings. These are water mixable oil paints, so I added a bit of water to make the paint runnier. I didn't end up adding any oil, but if you do, you need to start with water or turpentine for the base layer and then add oil to the top layers to follow the fat over lean rule. More oil on top of less oil. I had to press the paint into the nooks and crannies with a hard paintbrush because the surface wasn't smooth enough. So if I did this again, I would sand the wood more before painting. Layering didn't really work since the paint was still wet, so I couldn't add highlights like I tried to, they would just blend in. I ended up using the greens after all. The emerald green turned out pretty nice for the trees. I'm not fully following the colors from the photo, but instead using some pinks and purples on the ground to mirror the sunset sky. Blues in the shadows, especially since the initial sketch would blend in as I was painting on top of it. This gets kind of messy even if you try using different brushes for different colors, they just end up blending anyway. I painted this standing up with the adjustable desk and it worked nicely. I need to do that more often. The Prima method does work for a quick painting, but when you try to start adding details and highlights, it doesn't work in one layer anymore like this if you started out very sketchy and loose. The primed one took me about an hour and then I moved on to the raw wood. Right away I could tell this was gonna be a painful experience. I had to press harder to get any coverage. The paint just kind of disappeared and I ended up using a lot more paint than I did for the first one, and it also took me longer to paint. The texture probably accounts for some of it, but I can feel a difference between the primed and unprimed one. The unprimed one is somehow resisting the paint. The primed one was more pleasant to paint. the paint was gliding better. I wonder if an acrylic underpainting would have done the trick even without the gesso. But I do not recommend trying this with no primer or acrylics, especially if the wood is this uneven. I'm only trying this as a fun experiment since I've made videos about priming painting surfaces and I get questions like, do you really need to prime it? So I figured, okay, I'll test it both ways. Sometimes painting on an unprimed surface gives an interesting effect. Sometimes it just makes painting harder, like in this instance. And sometimes there's no difference initially, but if you want your painting to outlive you, you're probably better off just using the methods and materials that are known to work. On the positive side, the unprimed one did dry faster, I guess because the oil is soaking into the wood, which meant the colors weren't mixing as much, so I was able to add the lighter yellow flowers on top of the darker field colors without them blending in too much or turning all green. The ugly stage was pretty bad with this one. I almost felt like giving up, but once I got over it and got in some more paint layers, the painting got easier. It just took more work. The primed one looks wet and shiny and has better coverage. The unprimed one looks dry and matte and there's still unpainted wood peeking through. I will eventually varnish both of these, but I don't have an oil painting varnish right now. Can you paint on clay flower pots with oil paints? I'll try painting on a primed and an unprimed terracotta flower pot with oils just to see what happens. I washed both flower pots and let them dry before priming one of them using clear gesso. This way they're the same color before I start painting and we'll have a better comparison. I tried applying the gesso with a brush first because the sponge brush was wet from a previous painting, and then I realized it doesn't matter if it's wet because you can dilute gesso with water anyway. I primed a bit of the inside too, and the rim was easier to get to with the normal brush. I let it dry for a few hours before the second coat and then let it dry for multiple days before I had time to get back to it. I wrote on the bottom which one is primed and which one is not. The primed one feels rough, while the unprimed one is smooth, so the gesso definitely gave it some tooth. I'm starting with the primed one so we can get a baseline and then highlight the differences with the unprimed one afterwards. When I was acrylic painting on clay pots, I came across the information that you don't want to paint on clay pots with oils, and I'm not sure if that's just because of the long drying time or because of something else, and it made me a little curious, so that's why we're doing this. I'm not doing much sketching, just painting a horizon line and going from there. I'm going to paint both of these in one layer, or rather one sitting, so I don't have to worry about the oil painting rules of adding solvents and oil. I am using a little bit of water because these are water mixable oil paints. I'm wearing gloves because I'm gonna have to turn the flower pot around and probably hold it at times, and I don't want oil paint on my skin. And this isn't like acrylics, it's not going to dry while I'm painting it. But I'm also propping it in place with popsicle sticks, toothpicks, a tape roll, whatever I can find. The coverage is not great, the colors look a bit muted, but it is easy to paint, the paints glide well enough, it takes paint pretty well. I'm painting a simple sunset lake scene from my own photos. For the sunset and reflection on the lake, I'm using lemon yellow, vermilion red-orange, scarlet red, and purple mixed from scarlet, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. And black and burnt umber for the tree silhouettes and the reflection. Starting on the unprimed flower pot next, and the smooth surface doesn't feel bad to paint on. But the paint seems to sink in, or the oil seems to be absorbed by the clay. The colors are immediately more dull and they go matte very fast. Whereas on the primed flower pot, the painting still looks oily and shiny and more vibrant. I'm using the same colors and trying to paint pretty much the same thing. The lemon yellow seems to turn brownish right away, more like an ochre, but layering does help a bit. I just don't feel like I have the same control. The colors aren't blending as nicely because the paint dries a lot faster. I've tried oil painting on unprimed and primed cardboard and wood before, and I can say that especially with wood, there's a pretty clear difference even while painting, not even including what happens to the paintings years or decades later. Painting on an unprimed flower pot certainly wasn't as difficult as painting on raw wood, but I will hold on to these flower pots and update you if there are any interesting developments. I don't know how long these will take to dry before I can actually use them as flower pots. Maybe weeks, maybe months. I'm not varnishing them yet, but I will once I have a varnish for oil painting. There are varnishes you can use even before the painting is dry. After this, I don't think oils would be my first choice to use on terracotta pots. But if you want a simple painting idea to do with acrylics, try this one.